Welcome to Prajim Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 47 of ASP.NET video series. In this session, we'll discuss about the regular expression validator control. Before continuing with the session, I strongly recommend to watch parts 44, 45 and 46 of this video series. Regular expression validator is a very powerful validation control. This control is used to check if the value of an associated input control matches the pattern specified by a regular expression. Let's understand what we mean by this with an example. Now on the screen you can see that we are asking the user to enter a valid email address. Now we know that an email address has got a pattern. For example, it needs to have some characters or numbers followed by an @ symbol followed by some characters or numbers and then a dot and then the domain name. Okay, so this is the pattern of an internet email address. Now if user enters anything that does not adhere to this pattern, we know that it's an invalid email and it should be flagged as a validation error. So which validation control can we use to match to a specific pattern? Regular expression validator control. And the only property that is specific to this validation control is the validation expression property. Now in the validation expression you see a strange expression here. This is called a regular expression. Now this regular expression is specifying a pattern like this. Letters of words, one or more letters of words followed by an @ symbol followed by a few more letters of words and then followed by a dot and then few more letters. Now discussing the regular expressions themselves is beyond the scope of this video. We'll talk about regular expressions themselves in a later video session. In this session we'll see how to use the regular expression validator control. Okay, as I said, the only property that is specific to this control is the validation expression. Now let us see how to achieve this, that we can see on the slide. We'll ask the user to enter an email address. If it doesn't match the pattern, then we want to show a validation error message. Let's see how to use regular expression validator control. So let's quickly design this web form. Let's create an HTML table. So table, and it has got a tr, and this tr will have two TDs. So one is that. So let's say we want to ask the user to enter their email address and I want that to wrap inside a bold tag. And obviously we need a text box for the user to enter the email. So let's drag and drop the text box and let's call this txt email. Okay, and then I need another row basically for the submit button. I'm going to use TD, but I want this TD to span across two TDs, so I'm going to set the call span attribute to 2. Okay, so let's drag and drop the button control onto the web form, and let's call this btn submit, and let's call this maybe save or submit. And then I need another tr basically to include a label for the status. So let's drag and drop a label control onto the web form, and let's call this lbl status, and let's get rid of the text property, and I want to set the font bold is equal to true. Alright, so we have the web form. Now we need to validate the email address that the user enters. So obviously we need a validation control. Email address has got a pattern and we need to ensure that the user entered email matches that pattern. So to match a string to a pattern, we can make use of the regular expression validator control. So let's drag and drop that onto the web form. So regular expression validator control. Oops, that needs to be next to the text box. So let's give this regular expression validator a meaningful name. Since it's matching email, I'm going to call this regular expression validator email. Run it is equal to server. Error message, let's give it a meaningful error message. Let's call this invalid email in case if the pattern doesn't match. Then we also need to specify control to validate property. So we are validating txt email text box, so that's the control to validate. And the most important thing is the validation expression. Now we can type the validation expression if we want, or .NET provides some built-in validation expressions already. Now let's set the forecolor to red so that the error message appears in red color. So forecolor is equal to red. Now let's select the validation expression, go to the properties of that, and we have this validation expression property. And if you click the ellipsis button next to the validation expression, you should see some of the built-in standard expressions provided by Visual Studio. Now I want to validate against, I want to match to the internet email address pattern. So we should have internet email address. The moment I select that, look at this, I get this validation expression. So I click OK, and now if I flip to the source, you should see, this is the regular expression. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this and see if it's going to match up to that pattern of the email address. So I'm going to say, maybe prajimtech@prajimtech.com. So that's a valid email address. So if I click, I don't get an error message. But on the other hand, let me omit that @ symbol, because an email address should have an @ symbol and a valid email address. So if I click away, look at that, I get that invalid email. On the other hand, if I put the @ symbol, but if I knock off the dot, dot is again required to have the domain name. So again, invalid email address. But if I put a dot anywhere, then it's going to go away. So here, regular expression validator matches a pattern. Now, whether this email exists or not, that cannot be tested by regular expression validator. Regular expression validator only, matches the user entered a string to follow a specific pattern. If it doesn't follow that pattern, then it's going to, flag that as a validation error. Okay. And by default, this client-side validation is turned on. Now, for all validation controls, if you drag and drop them, by default, the client-side and server-side validation is done. Now, user can disable client-side validation. So how do users disable client-side validation? Just by disabling JavaScript on their browsers, and we have seen how to do that in the previous sessions of this video series. But then let's say I want to, as a developer, I don't want client-side validation. Can I disable client-side validation? Absolutely. All you need to do is, all the validation controls has a property called enable client-side validation, or enable client script, which is true by default. If I set that to false, okay, I'm setting enable clients script to false. So in that case, what's going to happen, this validation controls will not generate the client script. So when I run this now, the client side validation will be skipped, in the sense the validation will not be performed on the client side. Look at this, I type this an invalid email address, and if I click save, I get this message invalid email, but after a post back. And just to prove that, let's click that save button. So if page.isValid, and we know this isValid property is going to return true only if all the validation control passes validation. Even if one validation control fails, then it is going to return false. So we know that if this property returns true, then all validations have passed. So I'm going to say label status.text is equal to, maybe we can say data saved, and then I want to set the forecolor of this one to green. So system.drawing.color.green. On the other hand, even if one validation control fails, we know that we are going to get false, and that would come to the else block, in which case we want to show a validation error message. So validation error, and maybe we want to say data not saved, and the color red. Okay, so now let's go ahead and run this and see. And remember, we have disabled the client side script generation. So now if I enter an email address here which is not valid, I click save. Look at that, the validation is happening on the post back. On the client, it is not happening. And all the validation controls support this property, enable client script. And to disable validation control itself, set the enabled property to false. Now, for example, let's say I don't want any validation to be performed. Maybe I'm testing my application or something, so I don't want this validations to slow my testing. So for temporarily I can disable these validation controls. If I want to do that, select the validation control and set enabled property to false. And the moment I do that, validation is not going to happen either on the client or on the server. Okay, so I enter an invalid email address. I click save. Look at that, it says data saved, which means page.isValid property has returned true. Okay. Again, this enabled property is supported by all validation controls. On this slide, you can find resources for ASP.NET C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.